Thank you all for coming. My name is Jeannie Gibbons, and I am chairman of the North Idaho College Board of Trustees. It's my pleasure today to welcome you to this wonderful forum that we have. On behalf of the Board of Trustees of North Idaho College, I offer the congratulations and good wishes to the Popcorn Forum Committee. Your work in this important series, Journey Through Time, the historical human quest for the good life, offers us a stirring exploration of our history and, in effect, ourselves. Congratulations are in order for securing as your headliner Dr. Clay Jenkinson once again. The topics you selected of nature, freedom, justice, equality, and economic security, survival of the family, and spirituality reflect the completeness of the program. North Idaho College is also proud to host the 10th anniversary of the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment in celebration on Friday here at 10 o'clock. Please join us for this important occasion because, after all, at this place, North Idaho College is where the coalition was founded. I would like to also introduce at this time President Robert Bennett. He's president of North Idaho College.
Good morning. This has become a very special time for me each year because I'm such a believer in the concept of the Popcorn Forum. As you see in the program, this is the 27th year we've had this series, and for the starting last year and this year, it's quite unique in the fact that you're going to have an opportunity to meet some very famous personalities, those of whom the human race, I guess, has put forth and says this is some of our best. You get a chance to hear them talk then with other famous personalities. I'm excited about the concept, and I know it's the crowd's a bit sparse this morning, but it's right after spring break, and I know that this will continue to increase. And if it's anything at all like last year, we will see this house filled very quickly. There's one piece down here. It says, the Popcorn Forum provides both the college campus and the wider community a platform for the free expression of divergent viewpoints. From my perspective, that's what higher education is supposed to be, an opportunity for people who think a bit differently to come together and share their thoughts and their ideas. So it's particularly impressive, I think, when you get the opportunity to come and hear the great minds that this world has produced come together and share their thoughts and their ideas. I have to share a personal note with you. So many people now have become involved in this, many of our faculty and our staff and people in the community, and they've taken on these different characters. Last year I had the opportunity of doing one of the people, and this year I'm going to do another. And I'm very nervous about that. The amount of reading that one has to do to be prepared for this is unbelievable. But I feel a little better now because I saw Tim Christie as I walked in, and Tim he's a veteran teacher and has been in front of people for many times, and he's a speech teacher. And he was also very nervous, preparing for his part, so I feel I'm in good company. I hope you'll all come to as many of these presentations as you possibly can, because I think each is going to be very exciting. With that, I'm very happy that you're here, and I hope that you all have a very nice time as you enjoy the festivities for the rest of the week. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those welcoming remarks, President Bennett. At this time, I would like to present to you one of the shining stars here on campus. His name is Neil Weber. He celebrated his 29th birthday this weekend. He is our student body president, and this afternoon he's going to participate in a mock murder trial, a death penalty case, in his state and local government with teacher Tony Stewart. Please welcome Neil.
Good morning. I am Neil Weber, the president of Associated Students, North Idaho College. It's my distinct honor to be a proud representative of the students here and welcome all of you to the College on the Lake, North Idaho College, to this year's Popcorn Forum. ASNIC's been a proud sponsor of this forum for 27 years, and we think this is one of the greatest experiences anyone can endure educational-wise. We really think that this is something that the community, the students, And just, I guess basically everybody gets a part to either take part of or just sit back and watch. And I hope all of you, if you can't make it to all of them, at least make it to as many as you can. With that, I'll keep this short so that I know how important the rest of the day and the week will be. But once again, I just want to thank you on behalf of the 3,600 students that attend NIC. Welcome to our campus. Thank you.
At this time, I'd like to acknowledge the captain of the ship of this popcorn forum, Mr. Tony Stewart. Thank you very much for all your hard work. Tony's a real good taskmaster, so he's been involved at every level of the planning and the development of this program. Last year, Dr. Clay Jenkinson cast a spell over this campus with his dynamic portrayal of Thomas Jefferson. This role won him acclaim throughout the country with a presentation to the President and Mrs. Clinton. The Jefferson role is one he has played over 1,000 times. He is the winner of the Charles Frankel Prize presented by President Bush, the National Endowment for the Humanities, their highest award for public humanities projects. And among his vast achievements, he has also taught literature, theology, and law at the college level throughout the West. He is presently working on a book on 1,000 years of human history. Today, Dr. Jenkinson offers us a new window on our history through a new character, John Wesley Powell. Powell, a geologist and ethnologist, served as the director of the U.S. Geological Survey from 1881 to 1892. Unlike other explorers who came to the West seeking riches and fame and exploration of natural resources, Powell focused on his study on tribal languages. Powell is the author of The Standard in Indian History and Anthropology, an introduction to the study of Indian languages. I would like Dr. Jenkinson to come out at this moment. Dr. Jenkinson, on behalf of the Board of Trustees, I would like to present to you a medicine bundle from North Idaho here. Thank you for coming and welcome.
My name is John Wesley Powell. My friends call me Wes. My colleagues call me the Major. And the Paiute Indians of the West call me Copperots. Right arm missing. Such is the colorful honesty of the Indian peoples. I lost this arm in the Civil War. On the 6th of April, 1862, at Shiloh. And I didn't let this problem, this crippling, stop me from the adventures of my life. On the 8th of April, 1862, in an age before any anesthetic whatsoever, an army doctor sawed off my arm just above the elbow. For the rest of my life, there was a tingling in the arm from the nerves which were slowly regenerating. I used to, around Washington City, carry my stump in the other arm to keep it from jostling too much. And eventually the pain became so severe that in the 1880s, I asked another doctor actually to draw the nerves out of my arm. That was painful. And the only implication of having only one arm during the expedition I made on the Colorado River in 1869 was that when we came to portages and had to carry our 8,000 pounds of luggage, I was free to go do geologizing and science. And once I got rimmed, the Colorado canyons are sometimes half a mile high, sometimes a mile. Nothing pleased me more than to climb up as far as I could on the sheer cliffs overlooking the river and take barometric measurements and simply study the surroundings. And one time I had climbed with my one arm up to a place, and I suddenly found, to my great chagrin, more than half a mile over the river, that I was stuck. I could neither go any higher with my fingers, nor go back down to the lower level. This is what's technically known as being rimmed, and I can tell you it's an exciting experience. Well, my hands were beginning to tremble, and my grip was beginning to loosen somewhat. And so I called out to one of my ablest men, a man named George Bradley, and said, "My friend, I should like your assistance." And he saw how much trouble I was in. He tried to come up from below and couldn't. And then he crossed and came up over my head on the cliff face, but he was so far above me that he could not reach down with his two arms to help me. Well, finally, in extremity, he took his overalls off, overalls that had been torn nearly to shreds by repeated dunkings in the Colorado River. And now with this frail piece of clothing, he held it down as a kind of rope to me. And he said, "Captain, grab onto the overalls." Well, in order to do this, I had to release my grip from the cliff wall. So to miss the overalls was to die, and to catch them was possibly to tear them away and fall to my death 2,000 feet below. But I did it, and George Bradley's overalls held, and I was slowly drawn up to a safer place on the canyon. I was rimmed one other time in the depths of the Grand Canyon, but on the whole, I must say that I did not find this disability to be a problem in the adventures of my life. You probably remember me as the man who first ran the Colorado River and its canyons in 1869. That was the last great exploration adventure in American history. But that's not how I wish to be remembered. I wish to be remembered for my science. My life's work can be summarized in just a sentence or two. The worst possible thing we can do as a nation is to attempt to carry the institutions and the practices of Eastern agriculture beyond the 100th meridian. Social structures, institutions, and agricultural systems that work in Iowa and Wisconsin and Kentucky cannot be imposed upon the arid lands of the West. To do so is to invite disaster. So my life's work was to attempt to bring scientific realism to the settlement of our arid regions. Unfortunately, my life as an adventurer brought me more reputation than my life as a scientist. And as you know, the American West refused to listen to that understanding of what arid lands can sustain. I was born in 1834 in upstate New York. My father was an itinerant Wesleyan preacher, a stern, hard-scrabble sort of man, and we moved frequently during my childhood to Ohio, to Illinois, to Wisconsin. And I might have been yet another son of the middle border, a farmer, obscure, had it not been for two things. First of all, when I was a child of about 8 years old, I began to have troubles on the schoolyard in Ohio near Jackson because my father was an abolitionist, and therefore I was an abolitionist. But Ohio, in spite of being technically in the northern tier of states, was not friendly to abolitionism. Therefore, I was frequently persecuted on the schoolyard by young ruffians. And there was a man in Jackson, Ohio named George Crookham. He was one of those great mentor figures that change young men's lives. He weighed 350 pounds. He was entirely self-taught. He had turned his barn on his farm into a scientific laboratory and school, and he had a habit of finding the most promising young minds in the district and encouraging them to take tutorial studies from him. He saw my agony on the schoolyard, and he saw my promise as a young scholar. So he went to my father, the preacher, and he said, "Britton, give me your son, and I shall turn him into a scholar." My father was reluctant, but he permitted it. Under the guidance of George Crookham, I learned science. I wanted to become a conchologist, a student of shells. I went rambling through the woods and the swamps of Ohio. I learned a deep love of the outdoors, and I learned to read books. He put into my hands Hume's History of England and Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire and many other texts. So I chart my mastery of certain types of scientific knowledge and my love of outdoor exploration to this chance meeting with George Crookham. And for his genius, his barn was burned down by local vandals who couldn't stand the notion that a great man could also be against slavery. And the second event which changed my life and changed it forever was the war. The war came in 1861, and it cut like a hot knife through the social fabric of the American people. Nothing was ever the same after the war. I immediately joined the 20th Illinois Volunteer Infantry. I went off to war, and as a student of fortification, I mastered certain styles of defense and won the respect of John C. Fremont. I helped to fortify Cape Girardeau, and I even got an audience with Ulysses S. Grant. In November of 1861, I took a 5-day leave. I went straight back to Detroit, and within hours married my sweetheart, Emma, and then returned to the war. But in the spring at Shiloh, an unfinished mini ball from a Confederate charge entered my right arm just below the elbow and shattered it. And 3 days later, it was severed. I convalesced and continued to serve in the Union cause throughout the war. This led to a kind of interesting story later in my life. I lost my right arm at Shiloh. There was a Confederate officer named C.E. Hooker who lost his left arm at Shiloh. And because I believed that once the war was over, we should move to national reconciliation as soon as possible, each year for the rest of my life, I bought a fine pair of leather gloves and sent him one of them. Well, when the war was over, there were all of these young people who had been stirred up by it. And suddenly peace was declared. And lives had been disrupted. There was a kind of restless, virile energy awash in the land, and a great disillusionment that Thomas Jefferson's dream of a peaceful, enlightened society had broken down into the worst of all fates, civil war. So young men were at loose ends, and the West was open and calling to us. And we came in unprecedented numbers. I was a professor at several small Illinois colleges, and I began a kind of historical society. And in 1867, my great adventures began. I came out to the West. I had planned to go to the Black Hills of Dakota, but there were Indian scares there, so I wound up in Colorado instead with my wife Emma and a small group of students and other professors. And we climbed Pikes Peak that year. The next year we returned. And this year we wandered around the source waters of the Colorado River, and we climbed Long's Peak, 14,255 feet high. I believe we were the first white men ever to do so. But while I was up in that headwaters district of the Colorado, I conceived a plan to run the river. It had never been done. So I gathered together some money and some volunteers, and the next spring, in May of 1869, my expedition started at Green River Station in what is, in your time, Wyoming. In Chicago, I had had 4 wooden boats, dories, built with sealed compartments, 20 to 24 feet in length. I had recruited 9 others, including my brother Walter, to make the expedition with me. Now, when we entered the Colorado Basin, in the tributary of the Green River, on the 24th of May, 1869, we were undertaking something that most people felt was simply an impossibility, to run the Colorado River under any circumstance. Why? Well, the Indians believed that there was bad medicine there, that there were demon spirits in the river. And so the Indians of all types shunned the Colorado. James Beckwith, the great black mountain man, had said there's a suck in the river, that there's some spot in the Green or the Colorado where the waters simply disappear underground. Others believed that the canyon became so constricting and the river so fierce that we would come to a falls or a cataract which would be too great to go over, even by lowering the boats, and yet the current would be too swift for us to return, so that we would be imprisoned in a death trap on the river, and so on. But I knew better. I knew that with caution and the use of science that we could make an honest run on the Colorado. And so we did it. 4 boats, the Emma Dean, named after my wife, Kitty Clyde's sister, the No Name, and the Maid of the Canyon. There were 10 of us when we began. 6 of us finished 100 days later. Now, no one died on the river, but 3 men deserted at the last possible moment, and we later learned that they were killed by Shivwits Indians up on the Colorado Plateau. 1 man left early, Frank Goodman, a florid Englishman. There are 3 or 4 places in the course of the river where you can get out. And at the first of those, he got out as quickly as he could. I'll tell you just a little bit about some of the men. Walter, my brother, was called by the rest of the men Old Shady. The war had had a damaging effect on so many people. He had for 10 months been in a Confederate prison camp, and his mind had been somewhat twisted by the experience. And so he was irascible and moody, and he would sing old Scottish songs at the oddest times. The men were frightened of him at first, but they soon realized he was harmlessly moody. My favorite was Bradley, George Bradley. He was a colorful man. It turns out he kept a secret diary of the expedition. He would go off privately in the confines of the Colorado canyons and every night write up his account, and his account is an extraordinary one. He said that he would agree to explore the river Styx so long as I could get him out of the United States Army, which I did. And you know about his saving me when I got rimmed in the canyons. One of the difficulties is that the river doesn't have any beaches in many of its places. So when you have no choice but to stop for the night, you often have to put down your mat on the narrowest sort of ledge or rock, sometimes at an enormous angle. So getting sleep in those prison confines is almost impossible. Meanwhile, the river is roaring like a locomotive, like 1,000 locomotives. One night, George Bradley wrote in his diary, "If I had a dog that was content to sleep where I am sleeping tonight, I would kill that dog and burn his collar and forget that I ever owned such a cur." We had a young man named Billy Hawkins who was pressed into service as our cook. We took 8,000 pounds of baggage. But the interesting thing is that by the time we reached the Little Colorado River, that is, by the time we came to the beginning of the Grand Canyon, our food supply was almost entirely exhausted. We had had a terrible accident 16 days into the expedition. I'll tell you about it in a moment. But the biggest issue is nutrition. We had hoped to supplement our diet with the hunt, but there's nothing to hunt in the canyons. We had hoped to fish, but you cannot fish in a river as turbid as the Colorado running at such speed. We had hoped that there might be Indian gardens, but there weren't. And so we had to eat what we had packed in our 4 boats at the beginning of the expedition. That was not a balanced diet, and it got less balanced as we moved down the river. So by the time we entered the Colorado Grand Canyon, which I named in August of 1869, we were malnourished. Scurvy was beginning to set in several of the men, and we had to finish the most difficult and arduous section of the entire adventure with no food. So in the end, it was a run against starvation as much as anything else. At any rate, Billy Hawkins was pressed into service as a cook, and our staple, we had bacon, we had some dried apples, we had coffee and some sugar, and we made biscuits, and this was basically our food. And his biscuits became so important to our daily happiness. You know, when you're in extremity, a biscuit matters, that the men began to call them Billy Hawkins gods. And he had been some kind of a rancher or bushwhacker before the expedition, so in the morning at dawn he would get up and make his biscuits, and then he would scream out, "Plunder, plunder, come and get it, bulls in the corral," and other nonsense. And once when we were at the confluence of the Green and the Colorado, and already we were short on food, and our bacon had spoiled, and our flour had been dunked in the river so many times that it was brown and filled with lumps. And he made us some of his biscuits, and we were sitting eating spoiled bacon, and we were naturally thinking of better food that we had had at other points in our life. And suddenly Billy Hawkins got up, and he walked down to the shoreline and rummaged in one of the boats and brought out the sextant, a scientific instrument by which one can determine latitude. Now, he was not trained in science. He was scarcely educated at all, and I could not figure out why he would do this. So I called out to him, "Hawkins, what are you doing there?" And then he announced that he was trying to find the latitude and longitude of the nearest apple pie. You cannot know what it's like to go in a 20-foot wooden dory backwards down the Colorado River. George Bradley, in his diary, on 29 separate successive occasions said these are the worst rapids we could ever encounter on this river. We had a fire in camp early on that destroyed most of our eating utensils and much of our blanketage. And on the 16th day out, when we were only 5% of our way down the Colorado River, and what we later realized was virtual slack water, we had an accident. I had devised an elaborate scheme of flag signals, because when you reach these rapids, you cannot run them. You must line down. And the way you line down is you have a rope at one end of the boat and a rope at the other. And the men take out most of the baggage and portage it around if they can. And then you lower the boat down to the extremity of the rope, and men downstream with the other rope hold on, and the boat is swept down the rapids, and they try to pull it back in. And this is the only way to maneuver down this treacherous river. And so I had an elaborate system of flag signals so that when I saw a rapid that we couldn't run but must line down, that the men would move the 4 boats to shore. On this occasion, the no-name, for whatever reason, did not pick up the signal. And the rest of us watched helplessly as the no-name with 3 men in it was swept over the rapids. The men immediately were thrown from the boat. We assumed that they were dead. The boat cascaded down the rocks and hit a giant boulder in the stream and split in 2 like a stick. Well, then the men popped up clinging to rocks for their life. We spent about an hour rescuing them. And when they came back on shore, we shook hands with them as if they had been gone on a voyage around the world. We were so delighted to see them. But now a problem. We are 5% of our way down the river. Fully 1/3 of our food was in that boat, now lost. And more interestingly, and by some quirk of the day's packaging, all of our scientific instruments had been in that boat. Well, aside from the romance of it, the only justification for this adventure was its scientific potential. I had brought 7 or 8 barometers so that we could determine the height of the canyons and so on and do some geologizing. And suddenly the scientific pretensions of the expedition were lost. I actually thought that night, a night of sleeplessness, that I must climb out of the river and somehow get to Salt Lake to order new barometers and return. Well, this was a silly, impossible plan. But then suddenly, 2 of the men, William Dunn and J.C. Sumner, offered to go to the little wreckage that was still caught in the rocks across the river and see what they could discover in the hull of the boat. They assumed that perhaps something had survived. I was worried about this because the river was so treacherous, but I gave permission, thinking perhaps a barometer was in the wreckage. But it did strike me as odd that they were so willing to undertake this rescue operation for a scientific instrument. So the next morning, with infinite difficulty and starting far upriver, they made their way across and pieced their way down to the wreckage. You know, we couldn't hear them. The roar of the river is just deafening, but we could see them like mimes as they began carefully to inspect the broken hull. And suddenly they were dancing around with a kind of ecstatic joy. And I thought, my goodness, this is a commitment to science. But it turns out that their joy was in the discovery that a cask of whiskey had survived. Now, I'm a teetotaler, and I forbade any spirits on this trip. And somehow, in the packing, they had secreted a rather large cask of whiskey into the no-name. So now we had a crisis. And I thought the real discretion now meant that I should redefine that whiskey as medicine and allow them to bring it back. And they did. And we went on. But we were crippled because 1/3 of our provisions were already gone. So this was difficult. 100 days in the river. Eventually, even I, the optimist, called it the Great Prison. Well, let me tell you a few stories from the expedition. I want to talk a little bit about names. One of the advantages, one of the joys of moving into an uncharted country is you get to name it. You get to give names to features that have never been named before. And we had several principles of naming on our expedition. One was to use honorifics to previous explorers or previous men. So we called a river the Escalante River after the Spanish traveler. We spoke of the Henry Mountains after the man who helped to create the Smithsonian. I called a falls in what's now Wyoming Ashley Falls, thinking that an explorer, a mountain man named Ashley, had been there in 1825. There's a place in the lower Colorado which I called the Crossing of the Fathers because of Spanish priests who had been there. That's one form of naming. It was a minor use in my system of geography. The second is to adopt Indian terms. The Indian term for one portion of the Gray Canyon is Tumpin-Winir-to-Weep, which means standing up rock country. And so we often simply translated Indian terms and then used that for designation, standing up rock country from Tumpin-Winir-to-Weep. The third system is literary. I didn't do much of this, but we did some. Dirty Devil Creek, Bright Angel Falls, Vasey's Monument. One led to a controversy. I early on called a certain canyon, the Canyon of Lodore, after a Scottish poem. And J.C. Sumner, who apparently was an ardent American patriot, protested and said, no, why should we call this unseen, this amazing and sublime place on earth after some old European nomenclature? We need new names for a new country with its new spectacular places. But the basic system of naming was purely descriptive. Beehive Point, Flaming Gorge, names like that. Let me give you from my published account one of my favorite scenes. This is how I came to name a place called the Cliff of the Harp. This will give you, I think, a sense of what it's like to be on a long, long camping trip in the midst of the Great Canyon. I said, at night we camped on the right bank on a little shelving rock between the river and the foot of the cliff. And with night comes gloom into these great depths. After supper, we sit by our campfire made of driftwood caught by the rocks and tell stories of wild life. For the men have seen such on the mountains or on the plains and on the battlefields of the South. It is late before we spread our blankets on the beach. Lying down, we can look up through the canyon and see only a little of the bright heaven overhead, a crescent of blue sky, with 2 or 3 constellations peering down upon us. I do not sleep for some time, as the excitement of the day has not yet worn off. Soon I see a bright star that appears to rest on the very verge of the canyon overhead to the east. Slowly, it seems to float free from its resting place, and at first I almost wonder that it does not fall. Indeed, it does seem to descend in a gentle slope, as if the bright sky in which the stars are set were spread across the canyon, resting on either wall and swayed down by its own weight. The stars appear to be in the canyon. Soon I realize that this is the bright star Vega, the harp. So it occurs to me to designate this portion of the wall as the cliff of the harp. You get a sense of what it was like, I think, to be there. Well, we finally came to the confluence of the Green and the Colorado Rivers, one of the most spectacular places on earth. And our provisions began to diminish, and the men began to be dispirited, and we wondered if we would ever survive this expedition. And one day we would be 3,000 feet into the depths of the earth, and the next day we would be 4,000 feet into the depths of the earth. And it was just extraordinary. And when we reached the Little Colorado River in the beginning of the Grand Canyon, I knew that this was a new phase in the expedition. This is what I wrote on that occasion. We are now ready to begin on our way down the great unknown. Our boats, tied to a common stake, chafe each other as they are tossed by the fretful river. They ride high and buoyant, for their loads are lighter than we could desire. We have but a month's rations remaining. Our flour has all been re-sifted through our mosquito net sieve. Our few pounds of dried apples have been spread in the sun and reshrunken to their native bulk. Our spoiled bacon has been dried, and the worst of it boiled. Our sugar has long since melted and gone on its way down the river, but we have a large sack of coffee. The lightening of the boats has this one advantage: they will ride the waves better, and they will provide little for us to carry in the event of a portage. We are 3/4 of a mile now into the depths of the earth. And the great river sinks into insignificance as it tosses its angry waves at the walls and cliffs that rise to the world above. Its waves are but puny ripples, and we but pygmies running up and down the sands or lost among the boulders. We have an unknown river yet to run, an unknown region to explore. What falls there may be, we know not. What rocks beset the channel we know not. What walls climb over the river we know not. Ah, well, we may conjecture many things. The men talk as cheerfully as ever. Jests are bandied about freely among them. And yet to me the cheer is somber, and the jests are ghastly. Well, then our problems really began. Scurvy, near starvation, and deep, deep fear, doubt. In your time, anyone who goes down the Grand Canyon knows what is to come. But in our time, we hadn't the slightest idea what was around the next bend. And so the men became increasingly restless. And finally, there was an incident. We came to a place which I later appropriately called Separation Rapids. 3 of the men who had been unhappy for some time, Orimal and Seneca Howland and William Dunn, came to me and said, "We're not going on. This is it. This is a suicide rapid. We cannot successfully go down this rapid. We refuse. We must stop." Well, what does stopping mean when you're in the midst of the Grand Canyon? It means literally climbing a mile up a nearly sheer cliff to a plateau of unknown dimensions. I went to each of the men separately that night after supper and asked him what his desire was. And all but 3 agreed to stay. But those 3 were adamant. And that was the most difficult night of my life. I paced up and down the little path by the river. But the next morning, we made all of the rest of the biscuits. It amounted to about 30 biscuits. And we split them into 2. And we gave half of the rifles to those 3 men, and we kept the others. And we gave them half of the food. And then they began to climb the canyon wall. Well, now the rest of us had no choice. There were 6 left. We had no choice but to take 2 of the boats and run the worst rapid of the Colorado River. And it was over in 90 seconds, because you either die or you don't. And our little boats went over like corks, and we were all swamped and nearly drowned, but everything survived. We had no food left. We had no scientific instruments. We just had empty boats, but we all survived. So we immediately took out our guns and fired them repeatedly into the air to signal the 3 who had gone away that they should rejoin us. But either they didn't hear us or they wouldn't hear us. And they climbed out and were headed towards Mormon villages in Utah, when they somehow got crosswise with a small group of Shivwits Indians and were killed. I didn't blame the Shivwits. I went back the next year to find out what had happened, and this is what they told me. That a white man, presumably a Mormon settler, had raped one of their girls, and they took these 3 men to be either the culprit or his colleagues, and they killed them in retribution. But that was a great loss to us. And now that we had gone over Separation Rapids, it was literally only 2 days before we were entirely out of the Colorado River. But of course, no one could have known that until that instant. We got to Grand Wash Cliffs, where suddenly and miraculously the Grand Canyon just dissipates away, and you can see the horizon for the first time. And that night after supper, we talked late into the night. We talked about home. We talked about the war. We talked about our adventures, and most of all, we talked about our 3 colleagues and hoped that they were alive. But they weren't. We didn't know yet they weren't. Well, then, several of the men, including J.C. Sumner, decided to finish the job. They couldn't stand to see us stop there, and so they went all the way to the ocean, into Baja. This seemed to me to be purism in extremity. When we came to Grand Wash Cliffs, there were a couple of Mormons fishing there. They had been sent down by Brother Young because Brigham Young knew of our expedition, and he felt he should offer us aid. He knew we must be hungry by now. And he also knew that if we had perished, perhaps our journals or our boats would wash up there. And so we were greeted by these men, and we had our first real food for many, many months. And then I went overland to Salt Lake When I reached Salt Lake, I read a newspaper account on the railroad saying that I had perished early on in the canyon. And I was suddenly an American hero. And that adventure launched my career as the first government scientist in American history. I became the head of the U.S. Bureau of Ethnography, which I virtually created, a bureau designed to study Indians and not simply to assimilate them. I became a pioneer of Indian languages and wrote a synoptic guide to them with a man named Frank Boas. And I became the second director of the U.S. Geological Survey. And I want to just spend a few more minutes before taking your questions talking a little bit about two more things. One is Indians, and the other is the West. In 1873, I made a trip with Senator Ingalls through Indian country, and we interviewed hundreds of Indians about what they wanted, what they needed, what their frustrations were with agents, with government assimilation policy, with reservation boundaries. I came back and made a report, and it really changed my thinking. And here essentially is my view about what to do about the Indian question. First of all, it's not right for us to moralize. They're at a different stage of their civilizational progress. We must acknowledge that. We needn't apologize for that. We shouldn't romance it. But we should accept it as true and not say these are barbarians and we are civilized. They're just at a different stage of their culture. Secondly, we should study their languages before we do anything. I studied Indian languages. I knew about 12 well enough and 6 very well. And it's amazing how much more one can accomplish in going to an Indian culture if you go with their language or learn it while you're there. Third, I refused. I never traveled with a military escort in Indian country. If you take a military escort, it stirs up more trouble than it can prevent. It's a provocation. It's an act of rudeness. It's a violation of their hospitality codes. And we should study them before we begin to plan for them. So that's the U.S. Bureau of Ethnography. But furthermore, it seems to me that assimilation should occur in this way. We should encourage them to learn English. We should encourage them to understand property. We should give them not clothing but cloth, not houses but tools of carpentry. And we should early on give them some herds of cattle or horses so that the principle of property can take root among them, because the principle of property is the great organizing principle of the world. We should discourage their religions without denying them their religions. And above all, we should show forbearance. I wrote this about the Indian problem of how little things can become great crises and how the United States government just routinely overreacts. I said in a popular article, some hungry Indian steals a beef. Some tired Indian steals a horse. Some vicious Indian commits a depredation and flies to the mountains. No effort is made to find the real offender, but the first Indian met with is shot at sight. Then the Indians retaliate, and soon the news is spread that war has broken out in Indian country. Troops are sent. They wander around the mountains and return. Perhaps a few Indians are killed and perhaps a few white men. Usually the sufferer in all such cases is the white man, because he has property that can be destroyed while the Indian has none that cannot be hidden among the rocks. His methods of warfare are such that we cannot cope with him without resorting to warfare means that are repugnant to civilized people. And after thousands and even millions of dollars are spent on an affair that at its inception was but a petty larceny, peace is made with the Indians, and we enter into negotiations to provide him lands which we cannot fulfill and give him annuities, the cost of which is a drain on the public treasury. No, forbearance, caution. This is the answer to this problem. So that, by way of Indians, I could say much more, but I will wait for your questions on this subject. Then the West. Let me close with this just briefly. I said at the beginning that the biggest mistake we could make would be to impose the institutions of human agriculture beyond the 100th meridian, and I mean it. Here's my view, that Thomas Jefferson's rectilinear survey system is entirely inadequate to the west. It may work in Iowa, it does not work in Idaho. We should abandon it, therefore. And instead of a rationalistic rectilinear survey which imposes a kind of chessboard on mountains and chasms and deserts, we should have a more flexible survey, a kind of topographical survey that pays attention to the actual contours and the actual capacities of the land. And so beyond the 100th meridian, I would stop using Mr. Jefferson's survey grid and take on a topographical grid. Furthermore, I would begin to talk not of states, but of basins. I propose that since the West had not yet been gridded out and states had not been created there, that instead of blockish states like Colorado, we create instead watershed commonwealths, sinuous states that follow the watershed. So there would be a Snake River watershed and a Little Colorado watershed and a Missouri watershed and a Columbia watershed, but not Washington and Oregon and California and Wyoming. And I said, furthermore, one basin should be denied by law from ever raiding the resources of another basin. Every basin should be integrated and should be sovereign, and if it wants to sell its resources, that's one thing, but they should never be taken by another basin. But most importantly, I said the homesteading system is inadequate for the West because most of the West cannot sustain dryland agriculture. Irrigation is required for agriculture in the West. For a farm where we produce wheat or tomatoes, 160 acres is too many. An irrigation farm is probably best smaller. I said perhaps 80 acres maximum. But a ranch, a pasturage farm, could never sustain itself on 160 acres, not on 640 acres. So I urged that our ranches have a minimal allotment of 4 sections, 2,560 acres, and probably more. You see the difference? That under the old homestead system, 160 acres mechanically allotted no matter what the land could support. Under my system, flexibility so that ranches have a minimum of 4 sections and irrigation farms have a maximum of 80 acres. Well, these plans, which I proposed in the Arid Lands Report of 1878, would have prevented the West from being a terrible struggle over resources, as you know it became. I believe that only 2/5 of the West is irrigable. Let me say that differently. The West, almost in its entirety, cannot support dryland agriculture. 2/5 of the United States is too dry for humid agriculture, for the planting of corn the way you see it in Ohio. So beyond the 100th meridian, there is very little till agriculture without irrigation. Then I said, how much of this can actually be irrigated? Well, my opinion varied depending upon the time I was examining it, but I said between 3% and 12% of the entire West can be irrigated. So only a tiny fraction, even if we had massive irrigation systems, could ever be irrigated. And then the question becomes, who controls that precious resource? In the West, water is the issue, not land. In Ohio, land is the issue, but in the West, it's water. So I suggested in my Arid Lands Report that water rights inhere in the land. In other words, that no parcel of land can ever be sold without its water rights. That's very different from the principle that you permitted of prior appropriation. At any rate, here's what I wanted to do. I wanted to prevent the settlement of the West until we had surveyed it scientifically and decided what lands were tillable and what weren't, which should be timberlands, which should be mining lands. And only then, after prior government classification of these lands, should they be deeded out. And secondly, we should not permit speculators to go to places that would become dam sites and canal sites and buy them up for their own profiteering. These should be controlled by the government of the United States so that there can be equity in the way that water is distributed. The problem is that There were already plenty of squatters in the West, and all of the easy irrigation was already occurring, where you simply divert the creek. So the irrigation that was to come to get us from 2 or 3% up to the 12 or 13% that was irrigable, that next phase was going to require massive projects, big dams, big irrigation companies. And the issue is, who shall control them? Well, I studied ancient history of irrigation in Iraq and Egypt, and I know this: there are only 3 ways to do this. Either giant government, giant corporations, or cooperatives. And I said in an article in Scribner's magazine that in this society, a Jeffersonian democracy, we mustn't permit giant corporations to control the settlement of the West. That would be ruinous. And it would almost be as ruinous to permit giant government to reclaim the West. The genuine, just, and Jeffersonian approach to this would be commonwealths, cooperatives, irrigation districts, pasturage districts. And in my 1878 land report, I proposed democratically based irrigation districts all over the West, where all of the irrigators would vote, but district and basin by basin, and democratic pasturage districts where all of the ranchers would vote and govern themselves. Well, unfortunately, you know what happened. William Stewart, the senator, the senior senator from Nevada, attacked me on the floor of the United States Senate and said that I was proposing some sort of land redistribution in America, that I was preventing the free market from controlling the destiny of the West, that I was locking up the West. And so I was stripped of most of my money and all of my power, and eventually I resigned. And the last thing that I ever did in this regard was in 1893 at the 3rd International Irrigation Conference in Los Angeles. I was now in retirement, and I went there as the nation's leading expert on irrigation. And when I stood up, I gave them a sober account of how much land we had, how much of it was irrigable, what sort of mechanisms would bring about that irrigation. And for that realism, I was literally almost booed off the stage. And as I was leaving, in disarray, in the last public statement I ever made, I said this: "Gentlemen, it does not matter whether I am popular or unpopular. There is not enough water in the American West to make possible even a fraction of your grandiose plans. I tell you, you are heaping up a legacy of conflict and litigation over the water of the American West." And then I went back to my home in Maine, and for the rest of my life I wrote essays. And you didn't listen. And now you have really made for some very difficult problems in the American West. Thank you. Do we have any time?
After we'll take questions.
Okay.
Mr. Powell, some of you ready for questions. Before you leave, you have to leave. All panels this afternoon, evening, and all week will be in the Bonner Room, the Student Union Building. On your program, it says either the auditorium or the Bonner Room. So for the panels, please come to the Student Union, and then all keynote speakers will be here.
How much time do we have?
About 15 minutes.
Okay, we have time for about 15 minutes of questions, and I'll take them on any subject. Yes, madam.
Who sponsored you, and how did you get your crew, and did they find any of the scientific instruments when they went over from Whiskey?
Good question. Did they find any of the scientific instruments when they went back to the no name? Yes, they did. They found 3 barometers, and they were damaged, but they were usable. And the barometers survived well into the Grand Canyon. The barometer, you have to climb up, and you use the barometer to determine the actual height of the canyon walls. How did I find the men? Well, several of them I had met in Civil War veterans circles. I think 4 of us were veterans in one form or another. Several I met on those first 2 trips to Colorado, and then there's a way in which one man recruits the next. Orrimal Howland was a newspaperman who helped to start the Rocky Mountain News. So that was the basis of the recruitment.
And
Who sponsored it? The Union Pacific Railroad agreed to transport the wooden boats from Chicago and all of our equipment free. That was an enormous bounty. And then my institution, Illinois Normal and Illinois Wesleyan, provided some of the funds, and I provided about half of the funding myself for the first expedition. Then I went back 30 times in the rest of my life, but only once more down the Colorado River. Other questions? Yes, madam.
How many miles do you go from, Wyoming to the river and the end?
It's only about, I believe it's only around 716 miles. The distance is relatively small. It's the danger and the rapids that make it so difficult. Other questions? Yes?
After the first trip to Colorado, did your wife go on any of these adventures?
No, Emma never went down the river, and in my time it would have been considered spousal abuse to take a woman down the Colorado River. I mean, literally. I'm not joking at all. She was a great adventurer. The second time in the second expedition in 1871 and 2, she was nearby, and because now I knew the river and so on, I left a lot of the administration to a relative of mine named Thompson. And I left the river quite a bit, and Emma and I explored the tributaries of the Colorado on horse and so on. She was about as adventuresome as a woman could be in that era, but I never once contemplated taking her down the river, and she did not want to go down the river. This is an ordeal. This is not a pleasure adventure of the kind that's available to adventuresome men and women in your time. This is an experience where death is hovering at every moment, and the Victorian view of womanhood meant that men could not in good conscience expose them deliberately to death risks. Other questions? Yes?
Do you find it ironic that despite your views on water usage in the West, that someone would name the largest man-made lake in the West in your honor?
Yes, it does strike me as ironic that Glen Canyon, which I named, really the most beautiful of the canyons of the Colorado, is now underwater and destroyed forever, and is called after my name, Lake Powell. But let me say this, it's not that simple. When I was classifying the West in the few years that I had as sort of the water czar of the West, before William Stewart undercut me, I designated more than 200 potential dam sites, because after the easy diversions are made, the big diversions to irrigate the West, and I believe in irrigation, have to be done by some sort of massive project. Now keep in mind, in my time a massive dam would have been about 100 feet high. So I could not have anticipated the 700-foot dams of later engineering. But I did designate more than 200 potential dam sites, and 2 of them are where your Hoover Dam and your Glen Canyon Dam are. So I was willing to dam the Colorado River, including the Grand Canyon. Why? Because I believe in the Jeffersonian dream that the world must be fed, and that the farming is the ideal way of life, and that the West is in some sense a desert until it's reclaimed. And I believe very strongly, and I know that this will offend some of you, but I believe that any cubic inch of water that finds its way to the sea has been wasted. That it is our profound moral and social duty in the West to lift every drop of fresh water out of its basin and put it on an ear of corn if we can. And that water running uselessly to the sea is a profound moral failure of a society that needs to feed hungry people. So there is an irony, but it's a double irony, because in a sense I was bringing on the very thing that has now destroyed the adventures that I made possible. I'm told that tens of thousands of people go down the river per year in your time. We were literally the first that ever did it, and we were considered to be insane for trying it. Yes?
In your explorations of the rivers, etc., did you ever have a concept of the underground lakes that are now so popularly used for irrigation, particularly in the Midwest?
Yeah, I knew that there were aquifers that could be tapped, but the engineering in my time made it almost impossible to tap more than a few dozens of feet down. You know, most of the irrigation on your Great Plains from North Texas to Nebraska comes from the Ogallala Aquifer, ancient fossil water. I knew that it existed, but it was a resource that I did not know that we would ever come to tap. But I'm certainly for using those resources. But here's my one note of caution. Science must be your master. Science must be your God. Science will tell you how much water you can successfully draw indefinitely, sustainably. Science will tell you how many mountain slopes you can clear without creating erosion patterns that go too far. So in every instance, we must find bona fide, trustworthy scientists, and then we must accept what they tell us and not deny it simply because we prefer greed or prefer development. The great mistake of the 19th century was that we were the first real age of science, and then we systematically ignored that science to enable human greed. If you can't listen to science in a republic, then there's no point in having a republic, because it is information that makes democracy possible. And information denied is a human tragedy. We must learn to live from science. Other thoughts? Yes?
How about your dad? Was he alive when you went down to Colorado?
Yes, he was, but by now I was far, far away from that world. I never admired my father. He was a hardscrabble Wesleyan minister of the kind. There were many people of this sort in my time for whom religion becomes a constriction rather than a liberation. And his view of life, his view of God, his view of human nature was antithetical to everything I believe. I believe in progress. I believe that man is master of his world. And I believe that life is on the whole good. And my father was a kind of Calvinist pessimist, so I would have much preferred to tell George Crookham of my achievement than my father. Any other thoughts? Am I missing anyone? Yes, I'm sorry.
How did you get water?
How did we get water? Well, we drank the river. It's not pleasant, but it was in my time clean in the sense that there weren't any chemicals in it. It was a turbid, dirty thing. What we would do is, there were many calm places on the journey. It's not all rapids, but we would take a kind of dipper and go down as far as we could under the surface and pull up relatively clean water. And at night we would put water in pails and let it settle out, and sometimes a third of it would wind up being red mud on the bottom of the pail. But you would be surprised if you went out on the river for more than a few days, even in your time, you probably would wind up drinking it, because thirst is the chief human need. Yes, ma'am?
How you went about studying the native languages and why?
My purpose in studying the native languages was that I don't think that you can be any kind of ethnologist in translation. That if you want to understand the Paiute, you must learn Paiute. Not only because it's an act of profound cultural respect, that's the most important reason, but secondly because every language has its own nuances. Every language has its own way of seeing the world, and you cannot see it through translation. And the translators, the Indians who know two languages, very frequently mistranslate and sometimes deliberately mistranslate. So if I come to the Paiute tribe and say, I so much want to know about you that I am willing to stay here long enough to learn your language, that usually allows that tribe to trust you. And I was made an honorary member of many different tribal organizations. But secondly, I'm just curious about all of this. How interesting. Here, think of it. Here we are, the most advanced society in human history. And right in our midst are these Stone Age peoples. That's an extraordinary opportunity, and we shouldn't simply say, come be like us. We should say, let's study them in their native ways and see how they see the world, see how they organize their economies, see who their God is, how they mate, how they name their children, how they name their places. We can only learn from this. This is an opportunity unprecedented in the history of the world. It's one of the reasons that drew me to the Great Basin and to the Colorado Plateau, because the Missouri tribes and the Columbia tribes and the southwestern tribes had all been distorted by contact with whites. But here were peoples who were basically still in their pristine condition. Once you start, you realize that Ute and Paiute are related, and so you begin to see connections between the different languages, and that led me to the classification of languages with Frank Boas. Any other thoughts? Yes, ma'am. I did not write an autobiography. What I did, and I'll close with this because I want to spend 1 minute out of character. I wrote an account of the expedition which was published in 1875. And what I actually did was take the two expeditions and collapse them into one for purposes of narrative. It's still in print. I urge you to take a look at it. I quoted a couple of passages out of it. In my time, science was not automatically supported by government. And so we had to convince the legislature, the Congress, that what we were doing was important. And by publishing this rather florid account of our adventure, I gained an international reputation, which then led Congress to release funds more readily. And I must say, back to the question of Indians for a minute, I must in candor admit something that I did that's not very honorable. The congressmen loved to have photographic sets of Indians. This was when photography was first beginning. And if I brought back an artifact or if I brought back a photograph, congressmen would be delighted by it, and they would be much more likely to support appropriations for the Smithsonian or for the U.S. Bureau of Ethnography. But what happened is that most congressmen had a kind of platonic picture of Indian, and it was a Sioux. It was a man in buckskins with beads and with a teepee and a headdress. And they couldn't really even recognize as Indians the Utes and the Paiutes and the Kanabs and the others who were very different from that style. So I will admit to this, although it pains me to have to be honest about it. From time to time, I would dress up Paiute Indians in Sioux costumes, take their pictures, and then the congressman would say, "Oh, how delightful. Here, have another $10,000 for your scientific work." Whereas if they saw a Ute in Ute costume, they would say, "Well, this is no good. This is not interesting. Show me a headdress." So this has caused some difficulty in the anthropological community in your time, because young anthropologists keep coming upon my photographs and saying, how strange that the Southern Ute were wearing Cheyenne costumes. Now you know the answer to this unfortunate story. Yes, one last question. It did, and you know, I don't know if you've ever had your teeth worked on at a dentist, but they start with something called Novocaine, a painkiller. This was an age before painkillers. And so first, of course, it hurt to be shot, but not nearly so much as it hurt to have my arm sawed off while I was awake, and not nearly so much as it hurt to have those nerves drawn out with tweezers late in my life. That was one of the most painful experiences of my life. But once your arm is off, you have to decide whether you're going to let it become your definition or whether you're simply going to ignore it. And I found I could do almost anything I wanted with one arm. I think what I'll do at this point, since we are out of time and almost out of audience, is stop being John Wesley Powell and become myself just briefly. Normally I would disrobe in some way, take off my wig or take off my beard. I can't, because I'm going to be in this guise all day, and once you take this beard off, you're sorry. And I do have an arm, by the way. It's just sort of tucked in here. But for the first few times I did this portrayal, I cut my arm off, but it was so awful trying to sew it back on I just thought it would be better this way. But I'm sorry we don't have more time, because the most important part of a program is the scholars portion, where you sort of go back and talk about it. But I think John Wesley Powell is an extraordinary man, don't you, with this vision of watershed commonwealths? Imagine how differently the history of America would have been had we listened to him. Does anyone have a quick question for me as a scholar about Powell? Yes?
How old were you when you went down the Grand Canyon?
Well, he was born in 1843, and he went down the canyon in 1869. So that would be what, 26 years old? Yes.
And I was wondering, how old was he when he died?
Well, he died in 1902. 43, 60, about 70 years old. Any other questions? Yes?
What mistakes were made in the Great Basin that would have been avoided under the plans of...
Well, I'll give you just one. I mean, the question is what mistakes were made. I think we're about out of time, aren't we? So let me give you just a very quick answer. Look at what happened in Los Angeles. Powell said no basin raiding. Well, Los Angeles could only have supported a popular, and there's a great book on the subject called Cadillac Desert, if you're interested, by Mark Reisner, and there's another great one by Donald Worcester called Rivers of Empire. But the short answer is, Los Angeles could only have been a city of about 60,000 people if it used its own basin's water. So in order to have a giant megalopolis of 8 or 9 million people, Los Angeles had to raid water, and it's raided it from two zones. From Owens Valley, one of the world's most beautiful valleys up on the eastern slope of the Sierra, and they destroyed that valley. And all the water, 99% of all that water, even today, goes down the Los Angeles Viaduct into Los Angeles. If you've ever seen the movie Chinatown, it's about this water raid. And the other source is the Colorado River. They sort of fudged the Colorado River compact and have taken more than their share of the Colorado River's water by the California aqueduct for decades. Now that's sort of ending. So now they're making elaborate plans to get water from Northern California, which is water rich in certain respects. Under Powell's system, they couldn't have done it. They would have had to be their own basin, and because they would have had to remain within their own resource base, Los Angeles would be relatively small, and Owens Valley would thrive as an agricultural zone, and the Colorado River would be used for its own basin's opportunities and management. And I'm sure there is a North Idaho analog to this. This happens all over the country, basin raiding. I now live in Reno. Reno is growing madly, and our source of water is something called the Truckee River. Now Reno is trying to buy basin water from something called Honey Lake. And Powell believed that this would destabilize, it would produce corruption and destabilize democracy. So we'll carry on many, many times over the next few days. Thanks so much for being here this morning.